All right, today we are going to do a introduction and summary of the ballet Swan Lake. Now, for some of you students, I can already hear you moaning and groaning that Swan Lake is boring or that the ballet is boring. And my guess is that you have never seen the ballet or you have never studied it in small amounts to sort of understand the work and the discipline that goes into being a dancer in the ballet. Uh, the the reason that I love this ballet, and I'll go ahead and be extremely biased in my summary here. The reason I love it is, I think it ranks as one of the top 10 most perfectly executed pieces of art that's ever been produced. And I'm not being hyperbolic. I would probably put it higher, except if I put it higher, I'm sure that people could, come up with a list of 10 other items that might need to go above Swan Lake. However, it is up there as far as just, perfection. It has, the themes are well-known, deep themes of the human experience that we have seen in other pieces of literature and art. The dancing is incredible, as well as the composition is, the music composition. I know that Swan Lake is sometimes held up as a butt of a joke, especially in sitcoms when we have, these sort of 90s sitcoms where a wife wants to go on a night on, some night on the town, and she drags her husband to Swan Lake, and he's very, very reluctant. I grew up with all those jokes and with seeing all those sitcoms, but once I started to learn a little bit about the ballet, and specifically Swan Lake, I was just amazed how inaccurate that portrayal is. Um, this ballet is absolutely astonishing, and I recommend everybody watch it. You can watch it on YouTube, but I would definitely, recommend trying to put it on your list of things that you should see live and in person at some point in your life. All right. Museums, you can go to museums and you can see pieces of art. They're a little bit sort of easier to see and have access to. Um, but watching a ballet live, watching Swan Lake live, there's so much that goes into it, um, that it really becomes an experience. So when you think about the story, the dancers, the choreographers, um, all of the behind the scenes stuff that goes into a 2 hour production of this, you start to realize why it is held up as sort of the premier ballet, and why it has withstood the test of time over the last 130 plus years of being performed. So this is a ballet that is performed all over the world, in multiple cities. This coming February of 2021, the Pennsylvania Ballet is going to do Swan Lake. It did it a few years ago. I already have tickets to see it in February. I got myself birthday tickets to go and see it. I've seen it a few times now. But it is a sight to see. And here's the thing. If you learn a little bit about the ballet, just learn a little bit about sort of what goes into ballerina training, really is what we're talking about. And if you learn a little bit about the story behind Swan Lake, you're going to go in and you're going to have a deeper appreciation for how impactful and incredible this is as a piece of artwork. All right. So we'll talk a little bit about we'll talk a little bit about all this, and I'm going to try to make this summary relatively short to keep you interested. But hopefully you engage with learning a little bit more about this, maybe watching a YouTube clip, watching the ballet on YouTube at some point. So some quick background information on Swan Lake. It was composed by this gentleman here named Tchaikovsky, who you all know from, he's a music composer from Russia. He did the Nutcracker, so you all hear his music every Christmas when you're walking around buying Christmas presents. He also did the 1812 Overture, which is that 15-long piece of music that ends with a big cannon blast, which I'm sure you have also heard probably in movies somewhere. Reisinger is the choreographer. Both of these individuals are Russian. So he's the one who first choreographed the dance, and Tchaikovsky composed the music. The story of Swan Lake, people are historians don't necessarily don't have consensus as to where the story comes from. Most think that it started off as maybe some sort of short story for kids, like a fairy tale or a fable. It might be like an amalgamation of multiple stories, as far as where it came from. But, you know, stories get lost, oral traditions. You know, there's definitely similarities in a lot of, you know, stories and fairy tales. And there's enough similarities where people could see, well, I can see how they borrowed a little bit from this fairy tale, borrowed a little bit from that fairy tale. But again, Swan Lake hits on so many important themes in artistic expression, whether it's fairy tales and fables. You know, we think about, you know, some of the themes that sort of become present today in like Disney movies. It just hits on so much, and it executes it in such this beautiful, impactful way. This is why I hold it up as one of the again, you know, top 10 most perfectly executed pieces of art that have ever been created. It was first staged in 1877 in Moscow at the Bolshoi. The Bolshoi is probably the most famous theater in the world, especially for ballet, and it's located in Moscow. In 1895, it was then showcased in St. Petersburg, Russia at the Mariinsky. It's not a typo, it just has two I's in it because it's a Russian translation. In St. Petersburg in 1895, this was the theater for royalty. So brief Russian history. St. Petersburg was the capital of Russia until the Russian Revolution in the early 1900s. St. Petersburg is known as the Venice of the North, so they brought in all these Italian architectures to plan everything in St. Petersburg. All the palaces are in St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg is just pristine, like European royalty on steroids. I've been to a lot of places, and St. Petersburg is probably the most beautiful city I've ever seen. After the Russian Revolution in the early 1900s, Stalin and his people moved the capital down to Moscow. So Moscow is currently the capital of Russia. This is where we have like the Red Square, the Kremlin. This is where Vladimir Putin lives. All right. So this is the difference. But the Mariinsky Theater was the theater for all the royalty, and then the Bolshoi is held up, you know, even today as sort of the most most famous theater. You know, this is a theater where everybody wants to perform. If you perform. This is where everybody wants to be. Quick summary of Swan Lake. So it starts off a story of Prince Siegfried. Siegfried is a prince whose parents are trying to marry him off. So it opens up with this feast and this festival where his parents are bringing in eligible maidens for him to marry. He is not that interested in the women who are coming across him in the first act. And you sort of see at the end of the first act, he just wants to hang out with his friends. And so him and his friends gather up their crossbows, and they say, okay, the party's over. We're going to go out. We're going to go out into the forest. We're going to come, you know, they're going to eventually come across the lake, right? They're going to go out into the forest, and they're going to, you know, shoot some things and have some fun. All right. This is what guys do when they're young. When they get out into the forest, they come across Odette, who is a white swan. All right. And she transforms from a white swan into a person. So he comes across her, and he's like, oh, crap, there's this swan, this animal, and now it's transformed into this beautiful young maiden, right? She explains to him that there's an evil sorcerer, right, named von Rothbart, and he has transformed her into a swan, and by day, she is in the form of a white swan, and at night, she is transformed back into her human self. But in order to break this curse of constantly transforming into a swan every day, she has to find true love, right? This is a very common story that we see, or a common theme that we see, right? Well, let's get a little bit further on with Odile here, and we'll come back to some of the similarities with other stories in literature and fairy tales. So the prince is taken away, you know, is taken aback by her. He's like, oh my gosh, I found true love. I'm gonna go back and tell everybody in the kingdom that I found this white swan. Her name's Odette, but you know, she has to. I have to figure out a way for true love to win out the day, and I'm going to marry her, and everything's going to be happily ever after because true love is going to break the curse, and she's going to be a human the rest of her life. The end. So the next night, the king and queen throw another party, right? And they start bringing in people again, and the prince is looking for Odette to show up. And he sees a woman who shows up who looks exactly like Odette, but it's this one, Odile, right? So Odile is the Black Swan, right? And I put swans in quotes because they call her the Black Swan, but she's never actually in swan form. All right. This is Rothbart's daughter. So von Rothbart is the evil sorcerer, and what he does is he gets his daughter and he transforms his daughter to look like Odette, right? To try to trick the prince into marrying Odette, right? So if his daughter becomes queen, right, and the prince is eventually going to become the king, then von Rothbart can kind of parlay his way into having some sort of power over the kingdom. Now we see this we see this similar type of theme in stories like Aladdin, right, the cartoon version at least, right? Jafar wants power, right? He can't necessarily get power, so he's like, maybe if I figure out a way to marry Princess Jasmine, then I can eventually become the Sultan, right? So there's all these ways in which, these evil sorcerer characters are trying to figure out ways to marry into the royal family in order to gain power for themselves. Odile tricks the prince. They have this wonderful dance, and at the end of the dance, he pledges his love, right? And this is when, pledging your love to someone and taking an oath meant something, right? We don't have these no-fault divorce laws. It's just like they're going to be together forever. That's what he pledges, right? As he is pledging his love to the Black Swan, Odile, the White Swan is coming up to the party. So Odette is coming up to the party. She is now in human form because the sun has gone down. She comes up to the party and she sees that the prince and the Black Swan are together and that he has sort of pledged his love to her. He freaks out because he's thinking, oh my gosh, I pledged my love to the wrong woman, but again, his word is his bond, so he can't go back on it. Odette realizes that her true love is now out of the picture, and so she's going to be cursed to be a swan the rest of her life, right? So she runs back into the forest. Now, with this sort of theme, we can see similar aspects with Ariel and Ursula in The Little Mermaid. All right, so Ariel is trying to get Prince Eric to fall in love with her. Prince Eric is falling in love with her, but then Ursula takes on Ariel's voice, starts singing, and Prince Eric's like, oh my gosh, that's the voice, that's the one I fall. So Prince Eric is being tricked into marrying Ursula, and there is this, like, the sun's going down, and they're getting married on a ship, and Ariel comes up and says, oh my gosh, Prince Eric, you're marrying the wrong girl. Prince Eric is realizing that he's marrying the wrong person kind of at the end as the spell gets broken. All right, so again, these are common themes that happen in many different stories, which why I think Swan Lake is such an important point, an important artistic point, sort of in this long tradition of lots of artist creations. All right, now we have the ending. So the whites, now depending on the ballet company that does it, all of them doing a little bit differently. All right. The ending, the White Swan runs back into the forest because she feels that she is now cursed and she's going to have to be a swan the rest of her life away from her true love. We'll start with the tragic ending first. She runs to the top of a cliff. She jumps off and commits suicide. All right. Very, very sad. All right. The prince runs up and sees her as well. Some have the prince just sort of sobbing at the end. He's lost his true love and he made a terrible mistake. Some have the prince running and jumping off right behind her. Okay. That's the tragic ending. There are some ballets that do a more happily ever after ending. So what they do is they say, okay, the prince runs Odette, the White Swan, runs and jumps off the cliff to kill herself. The prince jumps after her, and just sort of the whole aspect of finding true love is enough to break the curse, because both of them have shown that they're both sort of madly in love with each other, that breaks the curse, and then they sort of like float off into happily ever after land, right, as the curtains close. So depending on the version of the ballet you see, the few times I've seen this, I've seen it performed both ways. I've seen a tragic ending where the White Swan dies at the end. I've seen a happy ever after ending where the White Swan goes off the cliff, the prince also goes off the cliff, and true love breaks the curse. All right, so that's always going to be a surprise if you go and see this. If you go and see Swan Lake performed live, what's the choreographer going to choose as far as the ending is concerned? The themes of Swan Lake, we obviously have the true love theme, which I'm not going to focus in on for the sake of our class, but I'm going to go back to this idea of duality and how we sort of, all of us sort of have this sort of struggling duality in us along a lot of different axes. All right, so Our last class, we talked about intrapersonal communication, and we talked a little bit about both Fight Club as well as the god Janus, the Roman god Janus. So let's talk about the Roman god Janus, right? We have a past and a future. We have good and evil. We have good things in us and bad things in us. Yeah, we're old and we're young, right? There's all these things within us, right? So one thing that I think is, and same thing is true with Fight Club, right? So we have the narrator, Edward Norton here, and the entire movie, he's just talking to his alter ego, Tyler Durden, right? It's the same person, but they're two different characters within the film. And when you go back and watch Fight Club a second time, you start picking up all these hints when you're like, oh my gosh, here's how Edward Norton's just talking to himself the entire movie. All right, so it becomes more interesting the second time around. Now, one thing that I think is extremely interesting about Swan Lake is that Odette and Odile are played by the same ballerina. All right, and there's a discussion as to whether or not this was intentional or not when this ballet was first put on back in Russia in the late 1800s. Whether it was intentional or not, I think it sets up a very interesting conversation with regard to how the audience is going to react to the ballet. So by having the Black Swan and the White Swan characters, if they were played by two separate people two separate ballerinas that were shown to be separate the entire ballet, the audience would walk out and just say like, oh, it's the common sort of like good versus evil, the good versus evil plot line. Like that would be the ballet, right? And it would be good, right? It would still be a good ballet for all the aesthetic qualities that it brings to us. But I don't know if it would have the same meaning. Here's what I mean by that. The fact that Odette and Odile are played by the same ballerina, even though they're two separate characters, right? It's not the same as Fight Club, right? They're not the same character. It's not Janet. They're not the same. They're not the same character. But the fact that they're played by the same person, right? This leaves the audience walking out of the ballet with a little bit more sort of gray area with trying to sort of understand this tension between good and evil and right and wrong and past and future and young and old and everything else, right? So you see the ballerina performing, you're like, I know that Black Swan and White Swan are separate characters, but I also can't take my mind off the fact that I'm looking at the exact same person playing both roles, right? So there's this entanglement that happens with Odile and Odette. There's an entanglement that happens that makes it impossible for the audience to fully separate them into two different characters, right? And the fact that there's a little bit of an overlap and that the choreographer, either intentionally or unintentionally, created that overlap gives it just enough confusion where the audience has to struggle with, okay, who am I, right? Am I the White Swan? Am I the Black Swan? Am I good? Am I evil, right? Is it sort of like pure true love, or is it like manipulative love, or, I'm just doing this because my dad, the evil sorcerer, like wants some power in the kingdom? Like, there's this interesting struggle that happens when it comes to interpreting the ballet that the audience gets to walk away with, and I think that is fascinating. I think that whether, again, intentional or unintentional, I think like the fact, I think it's the right call that the White Swan and the Black Swan are played by the same ballerina, right? Because that makes just a little bit of this like mucky middle that really has the audience asking some deeper questions, and I think that's fantastic. All right, so watch Swan Lake. If you watch it on YouTube, I don't really like watching theater or ballets on YouTube or on a screen in general. It's just not the same. Like, there's something about going to live theater, live ballets that I don't know. The experience of it just hits at a different level. The end of February, you can get tickets. Hopefully COVID is managed, or at the very least, the theaters have figured out how to space people and vent the place properly in order to mitigate COVID. But the end of February, the Pennsylvania Ballet is putting on Swan Lake. And here's the thing. All right, this is my little plug for the PA Ballet or any sort of artistic stuff. People ask me, like, I've had season tickets to the Pennsylvania Ballet for about 5 years now. All right. And I also go up to the Pennsylvania Art Museum a lot. And people ask me, why it is that I do these things, right? Why is it that I'm so interested in the ballet? Like I don't have tickets, I don't have season tickets to like, I don't know, the Philadelphia Eagles football games or something. And my response is the following, all right? In 50 years from now, I do not want to live in a world where these classical pieces of art no longer exist. So sometimes I've gone and I've seen, Pennsylvania Ballet, which is a huge ballet company, right? It's in the middle of Philadelphia, right? I've gone to some ballets where the theater is only half full, right? And that makes me a little bit like, it gives me anxiety, right? And it makes me frustrated. There's all the work that the dancers put into their craft. The orchestra's there, the choreographers. There's all these people behind the scenes. So it makes me frustrated for that reason, but it also just gives me anxiety because I recognize that if we don't support classical works of art, these works of art, there's nothing that says that these works of art have to continue to exist, and that worries me. It worries me that there's a possibility that one day we live in a world where live performances of Swan Lake are rare, right? Or maybe one year there's nowhere around the world that you could even see Swan Lake if you wanted to. And so it's like, yeah, you want to, you want to commit to supporting things that you want to see last, a lot longer than just this year. So I would recommend going and seeing Swan Lake anytime you can live. Some things that I've mentioned to people as far as like why it is I got into the ballet, because I'm not artistic. I've never danced in my life. I would have no idea what I'm doing, right? But I've studied a little bit as far as reading up on it so that I can better appreciate it before I go in and before I go and watch ballet. So I learn about the ballet story, because there's no dialogue in the ballet, right? So I want to know a little bit about the story so I know what I'm watching. But I kind of I liken it to this, right? So I coach high school wrestling, and some of my wrestlers, they'll make fun of me for it, but I don't really care, right? I'll give it as good as they, I'll give it back to them as much as they give it to me, right? And what I tell them is this, okay? Because I wrestled for a little bit, I was around a lot of gymnasts growing up, and I know some dancers, right? I think there's this interesting community of people who perform these athletic feats that involve their entire body. So anytime you're engaged in some sort of physical activity that also requires you to cut weight in a certain way, or you have to, not only do you have to lift heavy weights above your head, but you got to be able to lift heavy weights with your feet and your arm, and you're upside down and you're in these weird positions, right? Where your body is doing things that are unnatural to just sort of regular movement. That is something that I have an appreciation for. And I think it's because I coach wrestling and I did wrestle, right? So I on a different wavelength, like I know what it's like to sort of be upside down in this pretzel position, and you're trying to use your arms in a certain way that are unnatural, right? So when I go and I watch the ballet, right, I see these dancers, and I'm looking and like being on your toes like that for a minute, across the stage looks, it looks graceful, and it's supposed to look graceful, right? But people are like, oh, they're twinkle toes. It's not that big of a deal. I look at that and I say, that is impossible. Like that should not happen. Like there's no way that a person should be able to do that for as long as that person does that, right? And so there's an appreciation from me that sees people doing very unnatural, impossible things with their body and making it look effortless. Because I understand, well, I don't understand what the ballerinas go through, right? But I can at least, I can somewhat understand what it's like to spend your entire life dedicated to a craft from when you're 5 years old. You have a small window to perform at the elite level, right? So most ballerinas are sort of out of the ballet by the time they're 30, right? It's like they have a very short window to sort of hone their craft and to sort of get to the elite levels of performance, right? And then also sort of recognize that a lot of these things are underappreciated, right? So again, I've been in plenty of theaters before that are maybe only half full, and I get frustrated where it's like, I understand what it's like to put your entire life into something that nobody else can understand what you're doing, and then you go out and you perform and you realize that there's just not that big of an audience for it, right? And this similar kind of things still happen in the wrestling community, right? It's very hard to get wrestling covered on like ESPN, for instance. All right. So I know what that's, so I can sort of, I understand what that's like, right? So this is why I in the last few years, I've become so interested and appreciative of the ballet and Swan Lake in particular. Learn a little bit about the story, all right? Understand the story of Swan Lake, and then go and see it live and just have a deeper appreciation for it. And again, because it's a live performance, you know, it's important to support it, because it's not like a painting where if no one visits a painting in a museum, they just kind of hang it up there and they don't have to do anything with it. If you know, classic ballet and Swan Lake goes away, it's like, you know, eventually in a few decades from now, like, it doesn't have to make a comeback, right? And I don't want to see that happen. So you know, go out there and support these sort of classical ways of, you know, tradition and culture, if you want to continue to, you know, if you want to make sure that they're preserved for generations to come. My students, your homework for the next class period is to watch Black Swan, which obviously, you know, dovetails nicely into the similar themes of Swan Lake, which you'll see. It's not a movie that's you know, is a direct translation of the ballet, but if you listen to the director's commentary, he talks about how he went and saw Swan Lake, and he's like, I think there's something interesting there. We can sort of dovetail that into similar themes with regard to Natalie Portman's character in the movie Black Swan. So watch it. You can watch it on YouTube, Amazon, or on demand. People in class have told me it's about $3 or $4. You can also you can get a DVD copy from the library. I know that the Media Public Library has it, but the Penn State Library also has it. You just have to make sure you order it now, because it takes a couple days to get to you, because they have to, you know, COVID disinfect it. Fill out your handout, email it to me. And if you want, you should also Google search and watch a YouTube version of Swan Lake. There's plenty of, you know, it's a 2-hour ballet. It's available on YouTube. It's not going to be the same experience, but if you want to see a little bit of the dancing, you can fast forward through, scrub through it, and see some of these things, maybe listen to a little bit of the music, if you're interested. All right. That's all I have for Swan Lake. I hope you learned something. I hope you become a little bit more interested in this type of artistic expression, and do a little bit more research. All right. I will see you all in class, I don't know, in a couple days.